Well, good afternoon for some of you, maybe good morning, maybe good evening. I don't know where you're all based. I'm saying good afternoon from London because that's where I am today, which is really exciting. And thank you so much for logging on and taking the time to come and join us, because I know as teachers, we've always got something to do, planning, marking, preparing. So thank you for being here. I also want to say it's going to be indeed an interactive webinar. So if you haven't found that chat box yet, have a look where you can find it, because I might ask you some questions to type in some ideas so you can actually share your ideas and we can respond to your ideas as well. What are we going to do today? Well, indeed, talking about implementing guided reading, but I'm not going to go straight in. I think it's important that we have a look first at reading. Reading, of course, and I don't need to convince you as teachers, is probably the most important skill for our learners. When we move from learning to read, they're starting to read to learn. And this is where they get lots of knowledge about science, history, mathematics, and even in our modern age and the social age, I think students probably read a lot more. Maybe not books, but text messages, internet, vlogs, all these things. So first of all, let's define what are we talking about when we talk about reading, effective reading. And then let's have a look how that journey to become an effective reader actually develops. What sort of stages can we see within that journey? And of course, guided reading is part of that journey for our learners. So let's have a look at what that exactly is and why that is so important for us teachers to use in the classroom. And the last part of the webinar, we look at some tips how you can put guided reading into practice in your own classroom. And like I said before, any questions, if I say something, you have a question or comment, please feel free to use that chat box as well. But there will be some time at the end for you to ask your questions. So let's start with reading. Now, I'm pretty sure that you read as a teacher. It seems to be something a lot of adults and particularly teachers seem to enjoy doing. So my question for you, actually there are two questions. What are you reading at the moment? Outside of classroom or in the classroom? I don't really mind. Second question, what is it that you like about reading? Why do you read? What makes you feel, I like reading? Yes, let's pick up that book. So please feel free to type some of your ideas into the chat box. And then we can have a look. What do you think? The World's Worst Children. Kensuke's Kingdom, interesting. I see some nice titles there. Thanks for this sharing that, Emma. Documentaries. Non-fiction. It helps me relax reading. That's a really nice one as well. Oh, Eleanor Oliphant. I just looked at the book in the bookstore. I haven't bought it yet, but it looks interesting. Escapism. Motivational books, lovely. And why? What is it that you like about reading? Somebody said it relaxes me, it's an escape and fun. Informative. So I think also a lot of us actually read because we feel we learn something about life or maybe about cultures, and at times as well about teaching, because I bet we all at times read about education. Yeah, good. So a lot of you speak about an escape. It maybe makes you relaxed. Also maybe if you speak about escape, it's that imagination. You're in a different world. It takes you away from what you have around you every day. It gives you ideas, indeed, Chester, for writing. It deepens your knowledge. There's a lot of development happening. Ideas, but also vocabulary, different perspectives. I think in general, when we look at reading and we ask adults, why do you read? They often say, it makes me feel good. And that could be because you feel good that you learn something. It makes you feel good because you sort of escape from your daily chores that you have to do. So for us, reading has become pleasure. Yeah, which is really important. But when I ask the question to my students, I don't know if they always feel that reading is pleasure. For us, indeed, it's relaxing and it takes you away. We have developed this reading habit over time, which means for us, when we look at words and letters, it's become more or less effortless. And I think as teachers, we've got to be aware that that is not where it starts. When we started out reading, it wasn't that easy, and maybe it wasn't that much fun because we really hadn't developed the habit of reading yet. So speaking about automaticity in that way, you look at a page, you just get the feeling, the good feeling about it, and you don't feel the stress anymore that we have from reading. Now, in some cultures, reading is maybe not something children do at home. It's not really part of their culture. Maybe it's more a narrative culture where you don't pick up picture books with kids. But looking at international schools where children start to read to learn, the text about science is in English, the mathematics books are in English, and it's happening a lot more, I think, in schools. Reading is probably the most fundamental skill for us teachers to establish and to develop with our learners so they're actually able to succeed in life, in the classroom and outside the classroom. Because reading, as you already mentioned, develops vocabulary. It also aids your writing. It gives you examples of how to write. It gives you styles. It gives you maybe words and ideas. You develop your linguistic knowledge, but also your conceptual knowledge on a topic. And what another one that's actually really important we forget is it develops concentration. Looking at the learners we've got in our classroom nowadays who are always on the phones, instant feedback, the developing of concentration and focus is a really important skill that is also part of reading. So I could say it really enriches my life, I think, but to be able to read effectively is also important for another reason. Have a look at the quote and see what you think. Do you sort of agree with this quote? Does it resonate with you? Because I think as teachers in international contexts, like Mark, that you said, of course, we just sort of, our job is to make sure that children can get to read effectively so they can do well in the other subjects at school. And we sort of open the doors for their future. If we just say to our students, read, and we don't teach them what is reading, what do they need to do, they might not become effective readers, which means they might not do so well in science and in maths, which is taught in English. And it becomes actually their future choices become more limited because we are not giving them those opportunities. So reading for us probably the most important thing to teach as primary school teachers. But before we go into what you actually need to teach as teachers of reading, any idea reading is? If you want to complete my sentence in the chat box, feel free to type in some ideas. Reading is what for you? Amazing knowledge, transmission of ideas, awakening, therapeutic, the window to the world. Oh, that's a beautiful one, Janse. The bedrock of education. I'll get all these nice set phrases here. That is beautiful. Informative. A process of building a map of meaning of the language. Motivating. Well, I hope it is. Yeah, the way to know the whole world. Lovely. Because I'm going to show you some definitions I found, and they actually really cover the core meaning of the word reading. So with your eyes open, have a look. Here are my sentences. Maybe you can work on one definition and see if you can read it properly. And if you're a keen typer, feel free to type it in. Good. Now you're all effective readers. So let's have a look then of those definitions. I'm pretty sure you worked them out for yourself already. So here are they in much better sentences. So you first look at the snake sentences in which I had connected all the words for you and to work it out. you had to read and come to these definitions. Good. So indeed, it's a quest for meaning, which requires children to be active. They need to think when they read. And it's very interesting that some of my learners often think, oh yeah, I've looked at the text. It's not just looking at the letters. You need to do something more to make meaning, because words relate to words in a different sentence, or sometimes we don't say exactly what we mean, but when you read the text, you can still sort of feel if it's positive or negative. So indeed, like Sandra said, it's very much an active process of meaning making for the children. That starts actually by looking at the printed words. These scribbles on paper that we call letters are not the same. I think there are 9 main different alphabets. So what we need to show them is that a certain printed symbol has a certain sound attached to it. So that's really what they need to start linking, that written symbol with the oral language they've already heard around them since they were babies. And then they need to start thinking, okay, so that scribble goes with this sound. Let me put the blend sounds together. Or that this is the word cats, that has an picture of an animal. I know what that is in my language. So there's actually a lot going on in their brain. They're looking at the symbols, thinking of that sound, putting the sounds together. The sounds are stored in your brain, so they find the words in their brain. They might see an image, they might see a translation, and then they can actually find out what the word is. And they need to do that for all the words in a sentence. So it's very active. And then once they have the sentence together, they can probably understand what we talk about. So a very active thinking process, and often phonics teaching is involved in the classroom to make links between sounds and letters. So good. So reading, meaning making. It's not enough if we think reading aloud, decoding the words. That is not enough, I think, of a definition of reading, because if students read aloud but they still don't know what it means, they're not really comprehending. And for reading to do well, they need to comprehend as well what they read. So quick reflection on those snake sentences. I don't know how you sort of read the sentences. Did you work out the sound for each letter, or did you sort of see the words in my snake sentences jumping at you directly? So it was really easy for you. How did you read those sentences? Words jumping at you. Yeah, I think, Chester, that is definitely what we experienced readers seem to have. We just look at it and you see the words in that sentence, even though I glued them together. When students haven't had so much practice in reading, they probably start to look at something they might recognize, they might put the sounds together. Oh, that's a word. And then they go to the next. Do it again, and then it might not work. So they think, oh, maybe that first letter still has to go with the word before. So again, for them, different stages of development, it might be working at sounds, word meaning, that works, or in the sense it doesn't, or it's looking at chunks of language and words jumping. Yeah. So good. So that is really how our students develop a bit of their reading as well, and finding out where word boundaries are. Very active thinking. Now, to make meaning of a text more than one sentence, let's say a little paragraph, for example, or a storybook, there's a lot more going on than what we just did, of course. So here are some processes that we need to make our students aware of, because if our students have problems with reading, they're struggling readers, as we might call them, it's not because they can't decode at times. They might be very good decoders. They might just forget a few of these processes. So the words that were jumping out at you, Noor and Emma, that was probably because you have prior knowledge. You've seen these words before. You know what they look like. You know what they sound like. You know what they mean. And it makes sense in that structure as it's written. So a lot of what we do is activating prior knowledge, linguistic, but also topical knowledge. Then we make predictions about what might be coming next. We make connections between words we read in the text and what we know about the world. And also at times we read something and we think, oh, wait a second. Does that make sense? So you're questioning what you read, and you might go back to the sentence before and you notice you've misread something. Sensitive, sensible is a very common word for some reason for my students. It's just a different letter. They read too quickly, they miss it, and then they think, oh, but that's not related to the heart, that's the brain. That word's incorrect. So you go back. That self-monitoring and reading is really important for us if we want to become independent readers. And of course, visualizing when you read a storybook, even when you hear people telling a story, quite often pictures pop up in your mind. And all these processes help you make meaning of the story. So good. So reading, in a nutshell, first of all, your students need to be able to have that decoding skill or the sight words, because there are some words that we can't really decode. So when you see a word, they need to be able to sound it out. The next step is they need to be able to link it to what they know. So their vocabulary, that's probably when you teach second language learning, vocabulary building is really important before you read, so they can actually link it to a word they know. And they need to do that at a certain speed with fluency, automaticity, because your brain can only keep 4 to 5 chunks of information active at the same time for about 20 seconds. So if they're very slow readers and they're still decoding, they might get to word 5 and then they've forgotten what the first word of the sentence was. So if that's the case, then it's really hard to start developing your thinking processes. So this is what they need. We need to explicitly teach those thinking processes. We stir it around a little bit, and that is sort of what comprehension consists of. So there's a lot of different processes going on at the same time. So it's not an easy thing for us teachers to teach. And the only thing I can actually say to develop that is through reading. Practice, practice, practice. Yeah, because when you said to me, the words jumped out at me, I just identified the chunks, I just saw it directly. That means you've got a very high level of automaticity. You didn't have to think at all about what you were reading. So you have space left in your brain to think about meaning making and actually to enjoy it. So when students don't enjoy reading, it's maybe not that they don't like the act of reading. They're maybe still struggling with this sense making of the text or this decoding. So practice, like in anything in life, I don't want to say it makes perfect, but it definitely makes these skills much more permanent for our learners. So how did we get so automatic in this reading and so fluent in reading? So there's a whole structure. If you look at reading, where would we start with our students? I'm going to take you through a little bit of that literacy journey. Now, one thing I do need to mention is that reading comprehension is not easy to develop for us as teachers in our learners. Even in an English classroom where all my learners are native speakers, it is not something natural to the brain. Your brain, as you might know, is made to storytell and to listen. So listening and speaking, the oral skills, those are the natural skills. Reading and writing probably started about 5,000 years ago. So that is something that is man-made, and our brain is not naturally inclined to just understand this. You really need to explicitly teach it, and different brains work differently at different speeds. So some learners will develop reading skills much better or quicker than others. And then, of course, you've got all sorts of issues like dyslexia, that the brain is differently wired, so it makes it even harder for those students. But even for students who don't have that, it can be something that's really slow in developing. So don't think, if you feel this, that you're the only one. It is not an easy skill to develop, but it's a very important skill, so we need to develop it with our learners. Now, this made me question when I read this quote, like, oh my God, how did I get taught to read? To be honest, I cannot remember how I got taught to read. I don't know if you remember, I might be showing my age, but can you type in this chat box, like, how did you get taught to read in your first language or in English? Were there stories? Were you doing phonics? How did that work? I'd be really interested and very curious to see what you type there. Rhymes. Yeah, Emma, that's really, rhyme is something that really sort of sticks in your brain, isn't it? An earworm. Too old to remember. Yeah, I joined that club. Stories, descriptions, showing them pictures, picture books, fairy tale stories. Lovely. I'm going to show you a little bit of the literacy journey, and within a balanced effective literacy program, there are 4 different stages that we often talk about with kids. And phonics, I think, is definitely something that's become more popular and also maybe more effective. If you look at research, it's proven it's worth it actually. But initially, when you start reading as a child, you probably recognize the first picture. It might be your mother, your father, your grandpa. It might be a carer or somebody at school. They're reading stories to you. Now, and this is quite cultural, I think, because, for example, in New Zealand, my Maori learners, they don't get people telling stories to them as much because we didn't have a lot of Maori picture books till about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. Now it's a lot more common that picture books in Maori language, which is beautiful. Yeah. Once we get taught those stories, we actually develop like a love for reading. It feels safe. You're with a person you like or person you love. You're actually using your imagination. So a lot of positive feelings associated with reading start to develop in this reading 2 stage. Now, honestly, if you ask me as an adult, I still love it when somebody reads to me. And I still read to my grade 7 learners, different books, of course, but I can't think of anything nicer than just sitting there and being read to and going on a little journey in my head. Yeah. So you get read to, you actually start to feel safe, and that love for reading starts to develop. The second stage in this reading process is that the teacher maybe gets you as a student more involved. So here, picture number 2 means that students are often involved by looking at the big pictures. The teacher might ask you to point out a word. We predict using the pictures in the book. So I'm really trying to highlight the visual clues and the phonological clues as well. Like, okay, what animal is it? A dog. Can you find a picture? Okay, so where is the word dog? Point at the word on the page. So we're really trying to make that relation between the written script and the sounds. And students are much more involved because I ask them questions to join me and to help me read. But most of the reading in stage 2 is still what I do. I use my voice, I'm very expressive to get that fluency, how we read with feeling across as well. Once students have a little bit more awareness of strategies they can use, we might move on to the third stage, that guided reading. Now, I'm not saying you only do 1, 2, or 3. I might still do 2 to model the strategies. I might still do 1 after coffee break and the kids just love running around, come back and I need to settle them. But in stage 3, I'm really giving more responsibility to my students. They each have their own book, little books, and they're reading independently at the same page. And this is where I start to develop particular strategies that they still miss. Maybe it's rereading, monitoring. Does it make sense? Does it look good? Does it sound good? Maybe it is using the pictures to help you work out a difficult word. So there are different levels in your guided reading: print level, decoding, or maybe you work at comprehension level where you're really asking questions to check if they understand. All these skills they need to sort of have and be comfortable with. So the stage 3 is really there to develop their confidence and to make them think about the reading as well before we move them on to reading independently. And that's, I hope, where most of us teachers are as well, right? But we didn't just get there. Here, there's a book, read. No, there's a real process that we go through and that you often don't remember as an adult, I think, what we did in the classroom. So in 4, we're really creating that reading habit because hopefully they've got the skills to enjoy that. So picture 1 till 4, you can also put like on a continuum. So what you will see in the demonstration, the reading 2, I have all the responsibility. Whereas the shared practice, I ask my students some questions to help me read. And in guided practice, this is where the students read themselves. I'm just guiding or scaffolding them when they need me to get them consolidating the reading strategies they need for that independent practice. So that, in a nutshell, is actually your guided reading program. Now, then you might think, okay, guided reading, what's all the fuss about? I think there's a very good reason to do guided reading because this is what can happen with your learners. Nice to hear, Monica, that the first book you read you'll never forget. That's beautiful. So good. So for me, guided reading means a little bit hand-holding, as you saw in the picture before. Well noticed, Chester. Because if I don't support my students if they have difficulties, then they're going to become very frustrated in reading. You open a book, or not even opening, I just hand out the books and they go, oh no, teacher, we do reading again. So what we need to do in reading, I think, is work at the level our students are at. So guided reading, more or less, is a differentiated approach. I'm going to see where your weaknesses are and your strengths, and I'm going to develop what you need to develop to become a better reader. So you might read all at different levels, which means you read at a level that you're capable of completing. You can actually succeed at that level. And that is really important to keep that motivation. Too often, I think we see teachers using the same book for all 27 learners, but it just doesn't work for some because they're not at that level yet. What happens? You're a poor reader, you don't like it, you're going to read less, you become even a poorer reader. Yeah, so the gap in your classroom becomes much bigger, but that's not my main worry. I think my main worry is that the students lose that love for reading. They lack the reading skills, so they can't do well if maths is in English or science is in English. So we're really taking a future opportunity away. Yeah. Good. So reading and guided reading. Before I'm going to give you a nice definition that includes it all, what would you say is a good definition for guided reading? I've just given away a few clues already. Do you see how good your listening skills were there? Guided reading is, feel free to type into the chat box. Building all the skills necessary, yes, supporting them, personalizing reading, lovely. Teaching the book rather than teaching the students. Well, very good comments, Mark. I don't think in guided reading I'm teaching the book. I would say it's absolutely the opposite. I'm focusing on the strategies, is not so much about the content. Of course, to check that they comprehend the story, I will ask comprehension questions, but I'm really starting to model the strategies that students need to use, and then they use that in that guided reading session. So focused reading, focusing on your strategies there. Yeah. Sharing a text together. Good. I'm going to answer those questions all in a minute. So let me give you that definition first, because I see a lot of good things coming out there. Guided reading, and this is a lovely definition from Fountas and Pinnell. This sort of covers it all, I think. So to develop their reading power, we work often in small groups in the classroom. The reason we have smaller groups and not one whole class reading session is within my 27 students, the levels are so diverse. I might have a group working at level 11, I might have a group reading at level 8 still. So you really need to start to differentiate what you teach. So I've got smaller groups of students who are working at their level, and I sort of share the burden of meaning making, and I support, I prompt, I question, and I sort of guide them to actually make sense of that text and to work on decoding if that's still needed. So yes, they all have their own book, but I'm going to go into details a little bit better there. And we talk about the story, so we're making meaning of it together. So building their reading power, that's quite a powerful definition, isn't it? So looking at guided reading, some of my learners still work at the level of learning the code, which means they're still not fluent in decoding. They need to think about every word, they're sounding it out, they blend it, and oh, now they have the words, they need to find meaning. Some of my learners can read very fluently, very fluent decoders, and they're working on meaning making. So they're linking the words to maybe a word in their own language, they know what it means, they put the sentence together, and they understand the story. Then that other stage that we add to it is really thinking critically about what you read, higher order thinking questions. Is it a good idea? Would this be the same in your country? So there's a bit of a, I wouldn't say it's a cyclic movement, but they're all involved in this meaning-making process. And for me, those are the strategies that I want to develop to make it easier to comprehend what they read. Besides that, in guided reading, particularly with L2 learners, there's a lot of vocabulary that I try to feed in before we actually go to the text in your pre-reading stage. So they've got the language available to understand the text, but also in lots of readers, for example, the readers we use at Macmillan, those words are often frequent words students might encounter in daily life. And then, of course, we talk about the text. You think it's a good idea. We're trying to develop those critical thinking skills as well. And all this should help building confidence so they can do this better independently. Yeah. So what you're actually doing is creating a toolkit for your students to get ready for independent reading. Now, how do we get there? How do we go about developing all this with our learners? First thing, I think you need to keep in mind what your role is as a teacher. It is guided reading. Yeah, that really means that you're sort of a coach on the side. I love this image because I always tend to say, as a teacher, look at what's happening. Assess the student, monitor, observe closely, but don't jump in the water with them yet. If they start to struggle, this is where you come in, and then you prompt them. For example, duck or dog. For a lot of students, it's a very similar sound in Vietnam, for example. So they might read duck, and then you think, wait, have a look at that word, duck. Okay, go and look at the picture. What sort of animal do you see in the picture? And there might be a dog, and they say duck. And this is your role here to say it's a dog. What letter? G, g. What? They could air write it for you. You go back to the text. Can you find the word dog on your page? So you're really helping them to develop that skill here of effective decoding. So don't rush in to finish their sentences to read for them. Shared reading. This is where your responsibility is in reading. In guided reading, you sort of listen in. When they ask you for help, you give it. And when you feel you need to teach them something that they're not doing right yet, this is where your role is. You're a guide or a coach, if you want to say that. Yeah? So that's really important for you, your own role. Then where to start? Gosh, there's so much to say about this. I'm going to show you a little circle, and I'm going to talk through all of these in more detail. But the first thing, number one, assess and group your learners. I think, again, with anything I do in the classroom and in teacher training, I usually say to teachers, you need to get to know your learners. And it's not enough if you know the names of your learners. I really mean you need to know what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are. So that assessing of your learners is where you actually start. You can do that through observation in the classroom. You can listen in while they read and while they speak. But there are also different tools. Teacher guide for Springville to Comprehension you've got here, the teacher's guide for talk about text. They give you lots of different assessment tools. So the form on the left, for example, is the word test, they call it, from Mary Clay that she developed a long time ago in New Zealand. Here you give students a list of words. They're common sight words. They're also common words that they should know at a certain level. What they can read, they read. If they read it incorrect, you take note and you know about, okay, at the end of this test, they have said 60 out of the 100 words correct. You go to the index and you find what level they need to start reading. Then there is also a very simple letter identification test. They need to match capitals and lowercase. This is really lower level. And they need to make the sounds the letter makes. So that's really helping you if you're looking at decoding level. Where are we going to start? Level 2, level 4. If your students are okay with decoding, you can ask them certain questions about the text, and there are 3 different answer categories. Short answer, full answer, and referring back to the text. And based on the answers your students say, you can match sort of where they are in that comprehension. And again, that will tell you what sort of level book you can use for your students. So there's lots of different tests out there. Mary Clay observation surveys, I think she's got 5 different ones. Clay, C-L-A-Y. She is a reading specialist from New Zealand, and she wrote a lot in the 80s, but it's still very valid for sort of assessing the level. So once you know what sort of level your students, is there a test of vocabulary size? Well, there is that vocabulary one there, Mark. There is also writing vocabulary test, what she's got in her survey. I don't know exactly how it works because I don't have an example here, but go online and have a look. It will say these are 100 words they need to know for this level. They know less than 50, go to this sort of book. Yeah, so that will help you get an idea. But I think your observations as a teacher of what your students do is really important as well, what language they use in the classroom. So once you've sort of assessed your learners, you've got a bit of a feel which learners are maybe similar. Sorry. And I would say it's really important that you group your learners that are of similar level. Yeah. Now, a lot of research will say the same level. In all my years of teaching, I've never had students that were exactly the same. So I think if they're closely related to that level, maybe level 4, 5 goes together, maybe 8, 10, 11 work together, because honestly, you cannot have 16 different groups in your classroom. Yeah, ideally, with your 26, 27, you maybe have 5 guided reading groups, and that is probably the max. If you want to spend 20 minutes with those students, 2 to 3 times a week, developing their reading skills. So yes, they're working in small groups, 4 to 6 readers together of a similar level, and they all work on the same book. So that means that when you select your text, you need to make sure you get 6 or 7 readers of the same level of that particular book. They all need their own book. So you need to select your text very carefully based on the level they're at. And in guided reading, we don't want it to be too easy, because then there's nothing to teach. We don't want it to be too hard, because that's frustrating again. So just +1, Crescent's level. Yeah. So that's the sort of level you want to select. With that, I think you do need to keep in mind what your students are interested in. Yeah. One teacher in the classroom for guided reading, yes, and I'm going to tell you how I do it. However, it's much easier if you have a teacher assistant, but yes, you can do it with one teacher in the classroom. Yep. So I select my books based on interest, based on level. Level, this is probably why. Now, before you're going to tell me that's an old quote, I very much agree, it is. I do think this is still very important, and looking at more modern research like neuroscience, how your brain is actually memorizing and storing information, this is probably even more important. If you start to work at a level that's above the student's understanding, they cannot link it with anything. It's a bit like, what do you call that? Cotton floss? Candy floss? Candy floss. You get your candy floss. It needs to stick to something you already know. So for you to start reading at a level that is way beyond comprehension or the level of vocabulary they have available, it's not going to go in, because it's not going to stick anywhere. So this is why your assessment of your learners is important. And then, of course, yep, no surprise, we're teachers. We need to do some planning here. So you need to plan the assessment, that monitoring of levels. Then you need to plan who you're going to put in which groups. And that grouping, let me be very clear about it, is quite flexible, because I might read with one student for 4 weeks at a certain level, and she's ready to go to the next level. Then there might be another student who's there for another 4 weeks because they just haven't improved enough to go to the next level. So you need to be on your toes the whole time in that way. The most important thing in planning, and this probably, Shireen, goes a little bit back to what you were saying before. Yes, you can have one teacher running this, but you need to plan and think very carefully about what the others are doing in the classroom. Yeah, this is really key. This is going to make or break your guided reading lessons, because when I'm sitting at my table at the front, or the guiding reading corner, whatever you want to call it, I'm sitting there with my 6 learners. My other 19 need to do something, because if they don't have anything to do, well, I don't think I have to explain this to primary school teachers. Kids are not engaged. They start to misbehave, fighting, crying, classroom management out of the window, which means I have no time to focus on the people around me and be attentive to their reading. So what we need to do before we do anything else is think, how are we going to engage those learners who are not sitting with me for those 20 minutes? They're doing something independently. So in my classroom, I prepare stations for my students. They've got 4 different tables. They're stations, carousel, rotation, whatever you want to call it. I call them home groups. We do reading for 1 hour. Kids know which home group they go to. The tigers are there, the lions, the elephants, and the octopuses. Yeah, we all sit at our own tables, and they know what to do. One might have a box with reading tasks. maybe something from a reader we finished last week that they're going to reread. One might have a box on the table with word work to do, so they're practicing vocabulary, developing spelling, maybe linked to the story, maybe linked to science or maths. It's all literacy in the end. Maybe they're doing some writing a summary of the book they finished, or maybe they're writing about the book we used in storytelling this morning. I give them clear tasks. So you need to plan for each of your reading groups tasks that they can do in the time you're working with a guided reading group. Boxes are a great way because you can pop them in there. Kids can bring them back on the shelf. They can take what they need. Keep it simple is probably my main advice here. And also all these tasks, if you want to know more about them, they're often called the daily 5. So the daily 5, type that in Mr. Google, you find lots of activities and ideas. They're often the same task, but the content you can vary every week or whenever you read. Yeah? So do I make 5 lesson plans? Well, to be honest, for each guided reading group, I've got a mini different lesson plan, but I'm not doing so much anymore now I use Macmillan, because talk about text, for example, I don't know if you can see this, has got a bit of a lesson plan in there already, what you need to do as a teacher. So yes, for my guided reading groups, I've got 5 different booklets, maybe 5 groups. So indirectly 5 different lesson plans, and I need to give the others tasks to do. So that's why planning is a huge one. But if you don't plan, what is this saying? Failing to plan is planning to fail. That's what I've learned probably in my first month of teaching, that you really need to be ready, because in guided reading, you want to have all the attention devoted to your learners in front of you. Yeah. So I've got my learners there. Before I'm going to read with them, I also need to think about my plan, thinking, what do I want to focus on when we read together? So here I think there's probably just a standard list of reading strategies. With my lower level learners, I might still work on decoding. So we might reread, we might sound words out we don't know, break it up. What words can you see in that word that you do know? We might focus on sight words when they're low level and don't have that developed yet. Or we might use visual clues, use the pictures to help you understand what you read. If they're a little bit further on in the process, we might look at sequencing, making connections. Inferencing is a good one as well. The answer is not on the page. Can you work it out? So all these strategies you need to select, and 2 things you need to think of. I want to develop, for example, inferencing. Does it work in this booklet? No, because not every text lends itself for that particular reading strategy. So you need to make sure that you match, or you change maybe your reader, or you change your reading strategy. So the tasks that I use and the strategies are often the same with different contents. So that's indeed my bank of strategies I focus on, my bank of daily 5 activities. So also, I think it's really important as a teacher that you think about your guided reading sessions, my 20 minutes that I have with my students. 3 times a week with my weaker learners, I try to do this, and twice a week with my stronger learners. So every day there's an hour of reading in my program. I try to think, how can I and where can I slot in an opportunity for students to think and to buddy talk? Or maybe at the end have a little group chat about what we have read. Not only because it's nice for them to talk and not only to focus on the reading, it's also because talking really helps students make sense about what they read. It supports understanding, it consolidates maybe some of the language they've read about, and it's that collaborative support as well. They can help each other make meaning. So see if you can insert some opportunities for talk. And of course, when my students talk, I listen very carefully, and I might hear some misconceptions about words that they have got the wrong idea or meaning of. Then I can correct that at that stage as well. So the last thing I really need to think of before I do anything in my class is, what sort of follow-up tasks do I want to give my students when we finish the reading? We finish the discussion. I want you to go to a different table because now the lions are coming to join me. What sort of task can I create in that related to the reading we just did that really reconsolidate the strategies, maybe revisit the vocabulary, and that are meaningful to them as well. With my higher level students, it could often be a writing task because reading is a good model. With lower level, maybe it's sort of making a story path or summarizing what happened first, just different levels of work depending on where they are at the journey. Yeah, so in that stage of the journey. Good, so guided reading, and this is what you need to think of when you plan your guided reading, your 20 minutes with your students. It's not very different to normal reading in the classroom. You've got your pre, while, and post reading. You see that number 4 again, that independent follow-up task? That's when they're no longer at my table. That's when I give them some photocopies or a task to do or an iPad. Go, move away, I'm going to read with the others now. But you really need to think in my guided reading in relation to the booklet I've selected, how am I going to introduce it to the students? How am I going to get them started and make them actually want to read the story? So I'd love to hear from you. What sort of activities do you use to prepare your learners for reading? Yeah. You might want to have a look at this cover. Maybe you've got some ideas what we can do with this cover of the book. Feel free to type your ideas in the chat box. Looking at the images, yes. Golden oldie, definitely fabulous. Predictions, Elizabeth, lovely. Talk about their own previous experience, yes, because they can often link and it makes it more meaningful as well. Very nice. I'm going to show you some ideas here as well. Very simple. Point at Tom's diary. What's he doing? Yeah, so this, when I say diary, I'm just checking indirectly if they know what it is. If not, I can feed it in there. What's he doing? He's thinking. What's he thinking about? So you can really use the visuals to get them to predict about that story and link it back, indeed, maybe to their own daily activities. We can start to sequence. Lovely, Toril. What do you think he's got to do? He's planning, and what's he going to plan with these lemons? Where's he going to start this process? So lots of different stages. And I love this one as well. Why do you think he needs a calculator? Something they might use as well. Yeah, so they can maybe relate to that and discuss what you think you need to do to set up a business. That might be a nice prediction. Next stage, we could actually look in the booklet and see if he is going through similar stages as my students predicted. So your questions to introduce, again, really depend on the level of your learners. Yeah. So some more activities, the picture walk, I always love it. We talk about the cover, we predict what's happening, and then we're just not going to read, we're just going to have a look at the pictures. So this is a student book, which has got all the pictures in it, which is really nice. They're going to predict, they're labeling maybe images. We maybe have given them a true-false statement, anticipatory guide, and they said it's true, and we're going to see if that's really true. Lower level, letter and sound work, and of course we use oral language there as well. A very important one, if you work with EAL learners, second language learners, make sure that you feed in the vocabulary that is key for them to understand the questions or the answers in the text. Because if you don't do that, very frustrating. So vocabulary is something you really need to think and maybe do more of with L2 learners if you're reading in an L1 classroom in particular. Yeah. So you're really feeding in knowledge and you're activating prior knowledge, not only linguistically, also on the topic. If you're reading about koalas, well, I know what they are, but my students in Dubai, I think they've seen more camels. So we might have to show them a picture so they know what we're talking about, that front loading of prior knowledge and nexus. Then also in my pre-reading stage, I tell my students what we're going to do today. So we're going to see how the pictures help us say new words if we're not sure. So it's really supporting this meaning-making process. Different focus for different levels, all to enable them to do well in the reading. Yeah. So we've had a little chat, maybe 2-3 minutes. And the nice thing, the same booklet I just showed you, there's also one for teachers. The teacher's version has got all this information in it. So to be honest, there's not a lot of lesson planning that you need to do. It tells you exactly as a teacher, how can you activate the prior knowledge? What sort of questions can we ask? It even tells you as a teacher which words you need to pre-teach for your learners. Yeah. So very nicely done for us. Makes their life a little bit easier. Great. Good. So they're ready to start reading. Each student has their own reader in front of them. And I'm actually not reading, I'm just sitting there going to listen in. Now, can you think of some questions you could ask to check students' comprehension of the following pages? We're continuing Tom's business story. So what sort of questions could you ask to check their comprehension? Feel free to type it into the chat box for me. Oh, lovely. There's lots coming now. Wow. Yeah. Business, what is it? Indeed, if you've pre-taught that word, it's very useful to go back to that. What does he want to do? Why does he have to start a business? And that's really a good question because it's a school project. So getting all that language out there as well. How is he going to tell the teacher about his project or what he's doing? Yeah, he's going to keep a diary. Good. Where do you think he will find the lemons? Backyard, what is it? And that's a really good question, Rebecca, because they can use that image there as well. It can help them to make sense of that story. What did he do to start the process? Was thinking, making a list, very good. Lemonade, what would he do with that lemonade? So there's a lot, so much you can actually do with 2 pages. Now, again, in this series, talk about text, you don't need to do much at all because, again, some of the questions are already given to you. They have divided the reading session into pages. And I'm a big supporter of that because I don't think students need to read the whole book and then we talk about it. It's much nicer and much more helpful for learners to stop and co-construct meaning during the reading process. So I might say to my students, read page 2 and 3 alone, or buddy read. I read 2 to you, you read 3 to me, I listen in, and then I might ask some checking for understanding questions after that. Yeah, the ones on the left page, they're very much factual questions. The ones on the right page, where we talk about as a group, they're more of a higher level evaluative or inferencing questions. So we're really taking them beyond factual information on the page. While my students read to each other, pair reading or buddy reading, or while they read alone, I might tap someone on the shoulder and say, okay, read. When I tap them on the shoulder, they know they need to read a little bit louder or aloud if they're not reading aloud at all. So I can actually listen in to the decoding, to the stress, to their intonation, how that sounds. If that's all good, I'm not going to bother them. I might ask them one question to show me they actually understood what they read. The next set, 2 other students might read, and I listen to someone else very closely. I take a lot of notes as well when I listen to my students, so I can actually say, oh, you've improved in this, you do that much better. Or I might say, you still need to work on this particular sound or stress. So here is where they read, and I just monitor and observe that process. All sorted for you. So good. So your guided reading, I might give them 1 or 2 pages to work on. I've modeled the strategies or I've highlighted the strategy before, and they're just going to read. There might be a question, check your prediction. Then they all read, they decode, hopefully they make sense of it, which is probably the most important thing. And then I listen in and jump in when my students need me. So if they all go well, I might just listen and take notes. I'm not going to disturb them there. Yeah. If they do need me, I might prompt them and ask questions and scaffold and ask them to go back, sound out the letter. Or I might say, oh, go back, because the answer you just gave me is not sure. I'm not sure. Go back to the words. What words make you say da 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 da? So this is where you can see your misconceptions as well. Yeah. After maybe 2 pages, I stop my students, I get everybody back together and we talk about the text together. Here there's a lot of sharing of information, there's pronunciation practice, there's collaborative thinking happening. It's a very nice stage as well. And then we might go to page 4 and 5. So doing it this way means that you might not get through the whole booklet in one 20-minute session, but that's completely fine. They can do some word work anyway, and we finish off the story tomorrow. We can maybe even say, guess what do you think we're going to read about tomorrow? Which words do you think we'll see? So again, all this is in there in the teacher's guide for you, and it really advises you how to set it up, particularly when you talk about the text at the end of a page. There's a framework for students to answer, where we're actually teaching our learners that we don't answer in one sentence. You need to, in one word, you need to sort of have a sentence around it when you speak. So very nice framework for us to use as teachers. Yeah. So my role in this stage is to listen and scaffold when needed. Then, of course, when they finish their 4 or 5 pages, I don't just want to say, okay, bye, off you go. I want to wrap up that little bit of the reading session of the 20 minutes we had. So at times I do all sorts of activities. I'm just going to show you, because I think we're always running out of time otherwise. So I return to the text. I might ask them one question that was factual, and then I might ask them, do you think Tom is making good decisions? Do you think it's a good plan to sell lemonades in winter? Just to get them to think a bit more as well. There might be room for an inferential question, but that really depends on the text. And then I get them to respond to the text very quickly. Turn and tell your buddy the most exciting part of the story. Or I would say turn and talk, which means they can use something that's not 100% related to the story. Turn and talk. What do you think is a better thing to sell in our countries? I don't know if lemons sell very well in Dubai. They do actually, but maybe in winter in the UK might be something else. So they might have their own ideas. I'm trying to personalize in this last stage. And they can also say, we want to write about it. Good. That's something you can do when you leave this table, to personalize the text and make it meaningful in their life. A very important stage as well with learners is that I get them to reflect on what they did. So if you don't know the words, how to say it exactly, what can help you make meaning? Breaking up the sounds, looking at the pictures. Good. And often I ask one question like, what have you learned from Tom's story? Maybe they say that I can sell lemonade on Saturday afternoon and make some money. Fabulous. Because that way reading becomes relevant in their life. After those 20 minutes, I actually send that group off and I give them a task to do. Now, these tasks that they get to do and relate to the text or the vocabulary or the content, they're actually very similar to what the other readers have been doing. Again, they're your daily 5 activities. At times I say, okay, we finished the book, take the book with you. I want you to reread it quietly alone. Maybe they want to read it to someone, so they take turns. Maybe they get some word work on business, calculators, some activities we've created. Maybe they do some writing, write their own business plan and calendar. Yeah, so they're very similar activities. That's familiar and that's safe and easy for them to follow. Now, the series from Macmillan, they have Springboard to Connect, for example. You can see here, there are 3 worksheets for you to use as a teacher as well. So in that way, the planning is reduced to selecting what you want to work on: word work, writing, or comprehension. So that's really helpful for us. Also in this series and in another series, talk about text, or most of the booklets are e-readers as well. So you could download it on an iPad or a phone, tablet, whatever you use, and learners can sit together and listen to the story, which is great if they're still working on sound-letter correlation. But they get questions while they listen and they have to tap the right answer, and then the story continues. So very interactive way. And of course, you've got lots of other activities you can do after reading. As you said before, retell it in your own words, change the ending of the story, maybe even organize information in the graphic organizers, because that's really good to scaffold the thinking process. It's very visual. Maybe they want to write about their favorite part or a storyboard. Lower level learners might even want to make puppets if that's appropriate to the story and act it out, role play. So lots that you can do. Main thing, I don't really need to say this, do I? Planning it. You really need to be on the ball. You cannot just walk into a classroom and think, right, let's do some guided reading and we'll see what happens. Believe me, I've tried it, didn't work. You really need to be ready, have those other students set on a meaningful task and plan effectively what you're going to do, because like I said to you, there's different groups, lots of things to do. This is sort of in a visual way the process guided reading goes through. If you want to see more about that, there's a little guided reading booklet that Macmillan has published, and that you can get by sending an email to Rania at the end when you get the last slide. Yeah, so go and ask for that. It's got some tips in it, how to set it up, so you can read quietly instead of sit here and take notes. Yeah. Now this is a little bit what my 20 minutes looks like. So my cover, 2-3 minutes, introducing the story, talking about that, pre-teaching. It's about 9 minutes of reading. Now this is maybe why I say don't make your groups too big. If you've got 6 students there, you probably have got about a minute and a bit to listen and then listen to the next one. Yeah, so it's really quite full on to do guided reading. And sometimes you need 30 minutes when you start with it in the beginning as a teacher. Yeah, it's not always an easy process, but it's a very important stage for your learners. Should we select fiction or non-fiction books? Sure, very interesting question. Non-fiction is often easier for learners because it's got to do with imagination. So I personally think that you need indeed, Mark, a variety of resources and genres. Expose them to informative text about a lion, where they live and what they eat and things like that, like a brochure. Maybe you also want a story that's like a fairy tale. You might want something more that's like a little scary detective story or the Gruffalo. So I would say non-fiction is often, let me say fiction, non-fiction, fiction books. I've lost it now. Let's say storybooks and storytelling, where they use their imagination, is often easier to follow for lower level learners. So when they become more independent in getting those skills, vocabularies of a higher level, then non-fiction is easier for them to read. But yeah, mixed variety of different resources is really important. And for my students, talking about this carousel idea, they need to know what they are doing. So on my wall, I've got something like a visual chart that they can see what they need to do. And the first group, green, for example, they might actually start with some word work. They might actually start with some grammar work. You can also insert that in your daily 5, completely up to you. Grammar, that maybe the past simple came up in that story from yesterday a lot. Completely fine. Your focus, you need to see what your learners need. The second one, they go and sit with me, the teacher. The last stage for the green group is they're sitting and they're reading or rereading the story. So this is for them to visually very quickly check what's happening in this hour. Learners need some sort of structure, and it's good that they know what's going to happen. For me, or for my principal, it really looks a little bit more like this. So I've penciled in what my students are doing. The grey ones are guided reading with me. The other slots, they're doing the independent literacy activities, the ILA or independent activity time. Now, often when you have an hour, you can only see 3 groups. This was a 90-minute session every time, so I could see 4 groups. But if you see 3 groups in that hour, then you can see your higher level learners twice a week, your lower level learners 3 times a week. If you have a teaching assistant around, fabulous, or a parent who wants to help in the classroom, the more they practice, the more they develop that automaticity. Yeah. Good. And for us as teachers, I think we need to think about a few things as well as our toolkit. Guided reading means that you're reading at the level your students are at. So make sure there is a selection of readers available. If your class is grade 4, it doesn't mean that everybody is reading grade 4 books. Yeah, so you need different levels there. You need different topics. That grouping as well. You've grouped them nicely in week 1. Make sure that you keep on assessing and start looking at your learners. Are they ready to move up? Because some students develop very quickly and they could go to the next reading group, whereas others might spend 8 weeks at that level. Yeah, a modeling book, I don't really know another word for it. It's just a big A4 book, and I write in it, or an A3, and I write while my students make predictions so we can use it to check off when we talk about it. I also take notes about students' performance. So I have their name, like in a bit of chat, and I write what they do well, what they need to work on very quickly, because I don't have time to type things in when I listen. I sit with them on the floor quite often. Your stations you need to set up so they're a little bit away from you, that you've got some peace and quiet, your daily 5 boxes. You might want to get some mini whiteboards and markers that students can write their own answers to questions, or they can write their predictions, so to integrate writing more. And I think for me, a visual wall plan is a really good idea for your learners. So that's what you need to have in your toolbox. And a few things for you to remember. Reading is not a natural process. It doesn't happen like this. Your brain is not made for it. It's not wired to read. It loves to speak and listen. It's inherently a little bit lazy, they say. So teach explicitly those specific reading strategies that they need. The tasks that you set up around the reader, vary them, but make sure you've got maybe 6 or 7 different tasks that you vary, but that they become familiar with, so they can work with them alone. And also when you look at text, I think there's so much more that we can do with it than just say read and finish. Exploit it, think about a writing follow-up, maybe make a project, maybe do research online, really use that content as well. And allow during your reading session for students to share their ideas, to check predictions. Talking time is so important. That oral literacy, and that's what you really see in Talk About Text, really supports their reading as well. And the last one, the most important one, give it time. With that, I'm not meaning only give it an hour of your day. Also, reading doesn't develop overnight. I don't know how long it's taken us to become effective readers, but it goes slowly and at different speeds for different learners. So be patient and support them in this process. I think that's the most important thing you can do. Yeah, because it's a great journey from learning to read through to reading to learn. And it's not always easy for us, but where it can get them at the end, I think that's the most important, and that's what we do it for. You really open the door to their future. So good. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in for me as well. I'm having a look at Rebecca's question. Just need some water. Phonics activities. Yes, there's lots of different phonics activities you could do. Children, I've been having my children who are not reading with myself a phonics activity. I guess I should vary this. Well, there's lots of phonics activities. You can start with mini whiteboards that they can write words down that you show them on a picture, like the cats, or that they hear. They start to work on letter formation. Maybe you can even do activities with word cards, matching them with images. So yeah, I think you can vary your activities as well. There's a lot out there nowadays looking at phonics. Yeah. Good. Eduardo has a question as well. What do we have to do when working with a non-motivated student? Oh, Eduardo, I wish I had the answer. We would be so rich. I think it's quite normal that some students don't like reading. And I think there's lots of adults around. If I look around me, there's some friends who just don't like to read. I don't know why it is. Maybe because they're struggling readers. Maybe they just haven't found anything that really interested them. I think one of the first things to do with a student like that is to see if you can find something, a topic they're completely crazy about, that you can find a reader on that topic, so they really have the interest to get to know more about it. Also, it might well be that they're reading at a level that's too high, and this also frustrates learners. So maybe go to a different level that's a bit lower, and see how they respond there. Get them to bring something in that they want to read. It's not an easy one, but we do need to see if we can keep them in the program, because they do need those skills. Yeah. How to show learners, especially with phonics. Phonics is a whole different story. There's that letter sound correlation. The great programs that you can use with it, like Jolly Phonics, for example, Read, Write, and Ink, you can look at as well. Do I link readers to movies? Yes, I do. Sometimes I even find a little clip of a movie, like on Oliver, what's his name? There's a story about a penguin, and there's a beautiful little movie. It's 25 minutes. I might use the first 3 minutes to predict, and we talk about where they are, introduce the vocab. And while we go through the reader, maybe on Thursday afternoon, we watch a little bit more. So it's a little treat that they get that reconfirmed as well, and they hear the language again. Yeah. The concentration span of students to sit and read Poonam, very good question. It's very hard. If you keep them engaged with giving them questions and tasks to do, and maybe ordering the pictures of what they're going to read and check, if you have different activities, I would say guided reading is broken up in different slots. Normally, attention span is quite short of students. If they're 5, it could be 6 minutes, for example. But by doing all these different activities and not only read for 20 minutes, I think you can probably keep them engaged, maybe for 15 to 20 minutes. Assessment is you observing and listening very closely to what they're doing, decoding and fluency wise, pronunciation, expression, and then as well in the comprehension questions, asking them questions. If the answer is wrong, don't say directly it's wrong or right. Maybe just ask them, what makes you say that? And then they can point back to the right word or to the right picture. You know that they understand. Yeah. Louise, you like to link what students read to geography and even the biography of the author. That makes a lot of sense to them. Yeah, it's very nice if there's a story probably about a penguin to maybe show them a map about Antarctica and maybe link that back and get some context created. Lovely idea. Thank you for sharing that. I'm just looking at Raina. I think we're done with our time. All I can say to you is thank you for your active participation. I hope that was a little bit useful for you. If you want to contact me, there's my email, and I'm on Facebook on Teach Train. And there is some references for you as well. Those are some books I really enjoy working with and getting ideas from. And then I think I'm going to hand you over to Raina again. Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you from Dubai.